Well, I was born down in the Southland 20-some odd years ago. I ran away for the first time when I was only 4 years old. I'm a freeborn man. Boy, my home is on my back. I know every inch of the highway, every foot of back road, every mile of railroad track.
You know, of all the skills associated with bushcraft and survival, learning and mastering fire starting techniques probably ranks at the top of everyone's list. And rightly so, since fire plays such a huge part in survival. Body core temperature, water purification, cooking, and not to mention the huge part it plays in our mental psyche. I mean, there's nothing more comforting and reassuring at night than a nice warm fire to keep away the boogeyman. I think everyone's go-to for fire starting should be a simple big lighter first and foremost. But the nature of survival should prompt each of us to be prepared in case we find ourselves without it. Maybe it gets broken or we happen to lose it. Now, most people carry a Ferrocerium rod or a Flint Steel or sometimes both in their packs as backup. But I've noticed a lot of people just starting out studying fire starting techniques get Ferrocerium rods and their use confused with traditional Flint and Steel and its use. Now, that's nothing to be ashamed of, because with anything new it takes a lot of practice to familiarize yourself with the knowledge as well as the technique. Now, for those of us who have studied fire starting methods at any length, this might seem like a no-brainer. But if you're just starting out, the differences might not seem so cut and dried. So with that disclaimer, you feel free to skip this video altogether if you already are familiar with the differences. But if you're one of the many people just starting out studying these topics, stick around and hopefully I can explain these methods in a little more detail and maybe clear some things up for you. Now let's throw some sparks. Okay, so let's begin our comparison by first looking at the Ferrocerium, or the ferro rod as it's commonly called. It was invented in 1903 by an Austrian chemist named Karl R. von Welsbach. Ferrocerium takes its name from its two primary components, ferrum, which is Latin for iron, and the rare earth element cerium. Ferrocerium is classified as a synthetic pyrophoric alloy, which basically just means that it can spontaneously combust under the right conditions when it's exposed to the air. Now, this is done by rapidly scraping the rod with a good sharp-edged tool, which in most cases is generally the backside or the spine of your belt knife, or a special scraper that sometimes comes with commercial rods when you buy them. And when this happens, the material charge that are removed by that scraping, they rapidly oxidize in the air, producing hot sparks that can reach temperatures of over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You can also boost its fire starting capability by slowly scraping a small pile of the charge, which can later be ignited by the sparks created when you scrape it rapidly. The amount of heat and performance of Ferrocerium is dependent on the brittleness of the alloy and its low auto ignition temperature. This makes Ferrocerium useful in many commercial applications, such as the ignition source for lighters, where it's often known by the misleading name of flint. That's just a piece of ferro rod in there. We'll talk about flint more in just a minute, but it's also used for gas welding and cutting torch lighters. Ferro rods will produce sparks even when wet, making them one of the more popular pieces of survival gear and an excellent choice for an emergency fire starting tool. Now let's take a look at the traditional Flint and Steel, or fire striker as it's sometimes called. This method of fire starting has been around since before the invention of the friction match in the early 1800s. And it's what I would consider to be one of the most nostalgic fire starting techniques, since it's what some of the earliest pioneers would have carried with them in their kits as one of their main sources of making fire. A Flint and Steel is exactly what it's called. A piece of high carbon steel and a hard rock such as flint, chert, or quartz. The Flint and Steel I have here in my kit is simply a piece of old Nicholson file that I've belt sanded the edges smooth on, and what I believe to be a flint or chert rock that I found along the edge of the driveway. It's really not that complicated. If you know you have a piece of high carbon steel, you can simply strike it against your rock to see if it's hard enough to remove enough metal to oxidize in the air and produce a spark. Carbon steel, like ferrocerium, is pyrophoric. The difference being that the sparks given off by carbon steel when it's struck against the flint are only going to reach temperatures of about 800 degrees, which is considerably less when compared to the 2000 plus degrees given off by the sparks from a ferro rod. This means we need something to catch that spark and transform it into an ember, which we can use in conjunction with a tinder bundle to blow into flame. This is where charred material, the seldom mentioned third component of a flint and steel fire, comes into play. Now, char is simply natural material that has been exposed to heat in an oxygen-free environment and allowed to turn to carbon without burning up. The process is called pyrolysis. The charcoal you use in your grill is made with basically the same process. Material that has been charred becomes a very slow-burning fuel with a low ignition point, capable of catching that spark from that flint and steel and extending it through an ember, which we can use to achieve a flame. Charred material can be easily made by placing any natural material like cotton, punky wood, or cattail in a tin with a vent hole to allow gases to escape, and placing the tin directly into your fire until it stops smoking. Generally speaking, it usually takes about 10 to 15 minutes. It's important to note that while you can undercook char, you can't overcook it. So if your material isn't completely black or charred, just place it back in the tin and repeat the process. Make sure your tin has cooled off enough to hold it before you open it, since the charred material inside might ignite due to its low ignition point. Well, hopefully I've answered some of the questions you might have had concerning the differences and uses of a ferrocerium rod as compared to the traditional flint and steel method for fire starting. Now that you understand them a little bit more, I urge you to get out into this beautiful world that God's given us and practice not only these methods, but also all the other methods of fire starting. I can tell you from my own experience that it's a skill sometimes taken for granted. At least it was for me. And practicing any method will help you to understand the all-important triangle of fire of heat, fuel, and oxygen. How important each one of those elements are. If you remove just one of them, fire simply does not happen. I hope to do some more videos on each individual method as soon as I can find the time. Until then, this is Jeff, Mill Creek Bushcraft and Survival. God bless and thank you for watching.
Well, I was born down in the Southland 20-some odd years ago. I ran away for the first time